The traveling preacher made his first visit to the Harwell property in March of 1835. What he discovered in their root cellar would force medical authorities to question everything they understood about human survival. Reverend Thomas Whitfield had been ministering to remote Kentucky settlements for 12 years, but he had never encountered a homestead quite like this one. The cabin sat in a hollow so deep that even spring sunshine barely reached its weathered walls. His horse had balked twice on the approach, ears flat against its skull, refusing to move forward until Whitfield dismounted and led the animal by hand. The property showed signs of habitation. Split firewood lay stacked against the cabin's north wall. A functional well stood in the yard, its bucket still hanging from the crossbeam. But something felt profoundly wrong about the silence that hung over the place. No smoke rose from the chimney. No livestock moved in the small paddock. When Whitfield called out a greeting, his voice seemed to die in the cold March air without echo. He approached the cabin door and knocked. The sound was hollow, unanswered. After waiting a reasonable interval, he tried the handle and found it unlocked. The interior was dim and cold, furnished with simple handmade pieces. A table held 7 place settings, as if the family had simply stepped away mid-meal. But dust covered everything, undisturbed for months. Whitfield's attention fixed on a heavy door set into the floor near the stone hearth. A root cellar, he assumed, where families stored their winter provisions. He called out again, announcing his presence, then lifted the door. Stairs descended into darkness. The air that rose from below was strangely warm, carrying an organic smell he couldn't quite identify. He lit a candle from his saddlebag and descended carefully. The cellar was larger than he expected, extending well beyond the cabin's footprint. And there, arranged on thick beds of straw, lay 7 human forms. Whitfield's first thought was that he had discovered some terrible tragedy. The bodies lay motionless, their faces pale in the candlelight. But as he moved closer, he noticed something that stopped him cold. Their chests were moving, barely perceptible, perhaps 3 or 4 breaths per minute, but definitely moving. He knelt beside the nearest figure, a woman of perhaps 40 years. Her skin felt cool, but not cold. When he pressed his fingers to her throat, he found a pulse so slow and faint that he had to count a full minute to be certain it was there. Her eyelids didn't flutter at his touch. She remained perfectly still, locked in some state between life and death that he had never witnessed. Moving from form to form, Whitfield documented the same impossible condition. 2 adults, 5 children ranging from perhaps 5 to 19 years old, all breathing, all with faint pulses. None responding to his increasingly frantic attempts to wake them. Their bodies were arranged with obvious care, hands folded across chests, heads resting on folded cloth. On a shelf carved into the earthen wall, he found a leather journal. The most recent entry was dated November 7th, 1834. The handwriting was crude but legible. "The sleep is coming earlier this year. We have prepared as best we can. May God forgive us for what we have become." Whitfield stood in that underground chamber for a long moment, trying to comprehend what he was witnessing. Then he climbed the stairs, mounted his horse, and rode for the county seat. The authorities needed to see this. Whatever the Harwell family had become, they needed help that he alone could not provide. Sheriff William Crane arrived at the Harwell cabin with 3 deputies and the county physician the following morning. After confirming Whitfield's account, he immediately began what would become the most disturbing investigation of his career. The question that consumed him was simple. How had an entire family survived this way for what appeared to be years without anyone knowing? The answer began to emerge from the most mundane of sources. At Deacon's General Store in the county seat, Crane examined the proprietor's ledger books going back 2 decades. What he found suggested a pattern so bizarre that he initially dismissed it as clerical error. Every October, without fail since 1815, someone from the Harwell family had appeared at the store. The purchases were always identical in their excess: hundreds of pounds of flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, and preserved fruits. Enough to feed a large family through an entire winter, purchased in a single visit. Then, nothing. No purchases recorded from November through March, every single year. They'd come in looking half-starved, old Deacon told the sheriff, consulting his memory as much as his records. The father, usually. Sometimes one of the older children. They'd be thin as rails, eyes kind of wild. Wouldn't talk much, just pointed at what they wanted, paid in coin, loaded their wagon, and left. The storekeeper's description grew more unsettling. Last few years they seemed different, more animal-like, if you understand me. The way they moved, quick and jerky, and they'd smell the food before buying it, right there in the store, like they couldn't trust their eyes to tell them what it was. Crane's deputies fanned out across the county, interviewing anyone who recalled encounters with the Harwells. A consistent picture emerged of a family that lived in 2 distinct phases. From April through October, neighbors occasionally spotted them working their small plot of land or hunting in the hills. But their behavior grew increasingly aberrant with each passing year. A farmer named Dutch Keller recalled seeing John Harwell, the family patriarch, in the woods during autumn of 1833. He was eating, Sheriff, just standing there in a clearing, shoveling food into his mouth like he couldn't get enough. Had a sack full of dried apples, and he was consuming them, cores and all, barely chewing. When he saw me, he ran off into the brush. Didn't say a word. The most revealing testimony came from Martha Yates, who had once been neighborly with Elizabeth Harwell. She described visiting the cabin in the spring of 1822, shortly after the strange behaviors began manifesting. Elizabeth was crying, Yates told Crane. She kept saying they were cursed, that something had changed in them. She showed me her arms, how the hair had grown thicker, darker. She said every winter they slept more and more, that it was getting harder to wake up. Her children were changing too. She begged me to pray for them. Yates had tried to help, bringing the family to church services, but the Harwells' presence disturbed the congregation. They'd fall asleep during sermons, all of them at once, and they smelled wrong, like animals in a den. People complained. Eventually, Reverend March asked them not to return. Back at the cabin, Crane's men discovered the journals. 3 volumes, written primarily by Elizabeth Harwell, chronicling their descent into this unnatural existence. The earliest entries were coherent, frightened. She described the winter of 1814, when a late frost destroyed their crops, and they'd survived on grain purchased from a traveling merchant. By spring, something fundamental had changed in their bodies. "We cannot fight the sleep anymore," read an entry from 1828. "Each winter it takes us earlier and holds us longer. The children know no other life. God help us, we are becoming something else." The final entries were barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into crude scratches. But the meaning was clear. The Harwells had stopped fighting their transformation. They had accepted it, adapted to it, built their lives around these months of death-like dormancy. And in doing so, they had ceased to be entirely human. Dr. Samuel Brennan had practiced medicine for 30 years, but nothing in his training prepared him for what he documented in his examination of the Harwell family. His report, preserved in the Kentucky State Medical Archives, reads less like a clinical assessment and more like a chronicle of the impossible. The family remained in their dormant state for 6 days after discovery, despite every conventional attempt to rouse them. Brennan administered smelling salts, ice water applications, even mild electrical stimulation. Their bodies registered these interventions with slight involuntary movements, but consciousness remained beyond reach. What disturbed Brennan most was the physiological evidence of long-term adaptation. He measured John Harwell's heart rate at 4 beats per minute. Respiration averaged 3 breaths in the same interval. Body temperature registered at 82 degrees, far below what should sustain human life. Yet the man lived, organs functioning in some radically altered state that defied medical understanding. The physical changes were equally alarming. Every family member had developed a layer of subcutaneous fat, unusual for people who appeared malnourished during their waking months. Body hair had thickened considerably, particularly on the torso and limbs. Their fingernails showed ridge patterns, suggesting repeated cycles of growth and dormancy. Brennan's examination of their teeth revealed something particularly unsettling. Unusual wear patterns on the molars indicated extreme mastication pressure, as if they had been grinding through enormous quantities of food. He found fragments of raw grain embedded in several cavities, along with evidence of consumption without proper chewing. The digestive systems showed expansion, stomachs distended in a manner consistent with gorging behavior. On the 7th day, the family began to wake. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Body temperatures rose by fractions of a degree. Breathing deepened. Color returned to their faces. But the awakening itself was disturbing to witness. Elizabeth Harwell's eyes opened first, but there was no recognition in them. She stared at the ceiling of the room where they'd been moved, her gaze blank and animal. Her hands flexed slowly, as if remembering how to move. When she finally turned her head to look at Brennan, he saw something in her expression that made him step backward involuntarily. The others woke in similar fashion over the next several hours. The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 5 years, began making sounds that resembled whimpering more than speech. The older children showed slightly more awareness, but their movements remained sluggish, uncoordinated. Only Sarah, the eldest daughter, demonstrated something approaching normal human consciousness. Even she required hours to speak coherently, her first words a rasping whisper, asking what month it was. Brennan conducted physical examinations as each family member emerged from dormancy. Their bodies were consuming their fat reserves at a visible rate. Metabolisms accelerating from near stasis to frantic activity. Within 12 hours of waking, all 7 were ravenously hungry, displaying an appetite that shocked the medical staff. They ate continuously for 3 hours, Brennan wrote in his notes, not with pleasure or satisfaction, but with desperate urgency, as if making up for months of deprivation. The children became agitated when food was temporarily withheld for examination purposes. Young Thomas actually bit an attendant, who attempted to remove his plate. The doctor's attempts to understand the mechanism behind their condition led him to examine the contaminated grain theory suggested by the journals. He sent samples of grain found stored in the Harwell cabin to colleagues in Lexington for analysis. But the results, when they arrived weeks later, showed nothing unusual. Whatever had triggered this transformation remained unidentified. What Brennan could document was the aftermath. The family's bodies had fundamentally altered their relationship with consciousness, metabolism, and survival itself. They had developed the capacity to enter a state that resembled death closely enough to fool casual observation, yet preserved life through months of immobility. The question that haunted him wasn't whether this was medically possible. The evidence before him proved it was. The question was whether these people could still be called fully human, or if they had crossed some threshold into something else entirely. Sarah Harwell was 19 years old when she gave her testimony to Sheriff Crane and Dr. Brennan. Of all the family members, she alone possessed the clarity to describe what 20 years of this existence had been like. Her account, recorded over 3 days in April of 1835, remains one of the most disturbing documents in Kentucky medical history. She remembered the first winter clearly. She had been 4 years old when the change began. "We were hungry that year," she told them, her voice still weak from the prolonged dormancy. "Father bought grain from a man passing through. Mother made bread from it, and we all ate. It tasted bitter, but we were starving. By the time snow came, we couldn't stay awake." That first winter, the family had fought against the unnatural drowsiness. They pinched themselves, walked in circles, threw cold water on their faces. Nothing helped. One by one, they succumbed to sleep that felt different from anything natural. Sarah described it as falling into a dark well, still aware of falling but unable to stop. "I could hear things sometimes," she said. "Wind outside, mice in the walls, my mother's breathing next to me, but I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't move. It was like being buried alive, except I wasn't afraid. The fear came later, when I understood what was happening to us." Each subsequent winter brought the sleep earlier. By 1820, it began in November. By 1825, October. Their bodies demanded it, created an overwhelming compulsion, impossible to resist. Sarah described the autumn months as a desperate race to prepare before consciousness slipped away. "We'd eat everything we could," she explained. "Not because we enjoyed it, but because something inside us screamed that we had to. Father would hunt every day. Mother cooked constantly. We'd stuff ourselves until we could barely move, and still the hunger wouldn't stop. The younger children cried from how full their bellies were, but they kept eating anyway." The waking months brought their own torment. Each spring, the family emerged thinner, weaker, their minds foggy with confusion. It took weeks to remember how to be human again, how to speak properly, how to interact with others. And every year, it became harder. "We tried to be normal when we went to town," Sarah said. "But people could tell something was wrong. They looked at us like we were diseased. Children threw stones. Men cursed at Father, told him to keep us away. After a while, we stopped trying to fit in." Her younger siblings had never known normal life. Thomas, the youngest, was born in 1830. He had spent every winter of his 5 years in dormancy. He barely spoke. His behavior mirrored animal patterns more than human ones. The same was true of Catherine and James, born in 1823 and 1826, respectively. "They don't understand why you're trying to keep us awake," Sarah told Brennan quietly. "They've never known any other way. When autumn comes, they start preparing the cellar without being told. They know what's coming because it's all they've ever known." She described the cellar preparations with disturbing precision, how they lined the floor with straw for warmth, how they positioned themselves carefully, learning through trial that certain positions prevented cramping when they woke, how they left food and water nearby for the first desperate hours of consciousness. "Last winter, I tried to fight it," Sarah said, tears finally coming. "I wanted to stay awake. I wanted to prove we could still choose. But the sleep doesn't care what you want. It takes you whether you resist or not. And resisting only makes the taking more terrifying." She looked at the men recording her words with an expression beyond her years. "We're not a family anymore. We're something that looks like a family. We eat together, sleep together, but we're not living. We're just surviving one season at a time, waiting for the next sleep to come. When asked if she wanted to be cured, Sarah's answer chilled everyone present. I don't know if there's anything left to cure. Sheriff Crane's detailed inventory of the Harwell root cellar revealed a space that had been systematically transformed over 2 decades from simple food storage into something far more disturbing. Every modification spoke to a family's gradual acceptance that they were no longer entirely human. The cellar extended 30 feet beyond the cabin's foundation, dug deeper each year according to marks scratched into the earthen walls. At its deepest point, the floor lay 8 feet below ground level. The temperature remained constant regardless of weather above, hovering near 50 degrees. Ideal for preservation. Ideal for dormancy. 7 sleeping areas had been carved into raised earthen platforms, each shaped to accommodate a specific body. The depressions showed signs of repeated use, the soil packed hard and smooth from years of weight. Straw bedding filled each hollow, replaced annually based on the varying stages of decay in different layers. But it was the modifications to the platforms themselves that disturbed investigators most. Shallow grooves ran along the sides, where hands had rested in the same position winter after winter. The earthen walls behind each platform bore scratch marks at shoulder height, suggesting unconscious movement during dormancy. On the wall above John Harwell's sleeping area, someone had carved a crude calendar, marking each winter survived with a single vertical line. 20 lines total. Personal items surrounded each platform in careful arrangement. Elizabeth's area held a small mirror and brush, objects from her former life positioned where she could see them upon waking. Near Sarah's space lay several books, their pages warped from underground moisture. The children's areas contained simpler items: a wooden toy horse, a collection of smooth river stones, a tattered cloth doll. Deputy Marshal Griggs discovered something that made even hardened investigators uncomfortable. Behind a false wall of stacked stones, the family had created a secondary chamber. Inside lay the skeletal remains of dozens of animals: deer, rabbits, squirrels, even a black bear cub. All showed signs of being consumed raw. They were caching food like predators, Dr. Brennan observed when examining the remains, storing kills for later consumption. This behavior isn't human. It's what animals do when preparing for lean times. The walls themselves told a story of progressive isolation. Early scratches in the dirt formed words and dates, attempts to maintain human connection to time and language. But as years passed, the markings became simpler. Tallies, symbols, eventually just claw-like gouges in the earth, as if whoever made them had forgotten the purpose of communication entirely. Near the entrance, investigators found supplies that painted a grim picture of the family's final active months. Mason jars filled with rendered fat, sacks of dried corn, and beans, many showing signs of being eaten directly without cooking, and disturbing evidence that the family had been collecting their own shed hair, weaving it into crude insulation for the sleeping platforms. A tin box hidden beneath Sarah's platform contained letters she had written but never sent. They were addressed to no one, simply dated across multiple years. The most recent, from October of 1834, described her despair in careful script. I dream during the sleep now, dreams where I'm running through forests on 4 legs, dreams where winter is not something to survive, but something that feels right and natural. When I wake, I'm relieved to have hands again. But each year, that relief comes slower. One day, it won't come at all. The cellar's most chilling feature was discovered last. On the ceiling above the sleeping platforms, someone had painted a night sky. Constellations rendered in what appeared to be lamp black, mixed with animal fat. But the stars were wrong, arranged in patterns that matched no actual sky. It was as if the artist had been painting from memory of something witnessed during dormancy. Some dreamscape visible only in that state between life and death. Sheriff Crane ordered the cellar sealed after documentation was complete. But before workers filled the entrance, several deputies swore they heard sounds from below. Not human voices. Something closer to the breathing of a large animal in deep sleep, even though the space was confirmed empty. The sounds persisted until the last shovel of dirt was thrown. The Harwell family's descent into isolation had not been sudden. Newspaper archives and church records from 1815 through 1835 revealed a community that had watched them change and chosen to look away rather than help. The earliest mentions appeared in the Cumberland Valley Gazette from spring of 1816. A brief notice reported that the Harwell family had recovered from a peculiar winter ailment that had kept them confined to their home for several months. The tone was sympathetic. Neighbors had checked on them, left food at their door. At that point, they were still considered part of the community. By 1818, the sympathy had curdled into suspicion. A letter to the editor described encountering John Harwell in the woods during October. He moved through the brush like something wild, the writer noted. When I called greeting, he turned and stared at me with eyes that showed no recognition, though we have been neighbors these 5 years. His mouth was stained dark, and he carried the carcass of a deer over his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. Church records documented the family's attempted integration with painful specificity. Reverend March's journal from 1820 described multiple complaints about the Harwells' behavior during services. They fell asleep during prayers, all of them simultaneously, their breathing so shallow that other congregants thought they had died. Children sitting near the Harwell family refused to return to services, claiming they smelled wrong and made strange sounds. I spoke with Elizabeth Harwell after the service, March wrote. She wept openly and begged me not to turn them away. She said they were good Christians, suffering under some curse they could not understand. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something that frightened me. An absence, as if the woman I had known was already mostly gone. The final entry about the Harwells in the church records came from November 1820. I have asked the Harwell family not to attend services until they have sought proper medical attention. Their presence disturbs the congregation, and I fear for the spiritual well-being of the community. May God have mercy on their souls. School records showed that the older Harwell children had attended the county school sporadically until 1822. Teachers noted behavioral problems that grew worse each autumn. Sarah had been a promising student, but her focus deteriorated steadily. She fell asleep at her desk. She became aggressive when other children got too close. By October, she would stop coming entirely. The Harwell girl frightened the other students, wrote schoolmistress Ann Porter in a letter to the school board. She hoarded food, hiding scraps in her desk. She made animal sounds during quiet study. When I corrected her, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as feral. I cannot have her in my classroom. The community's active rejection accelerated after an incident in 1824. During the Autumn Harvest Festival, young James Harwell, then 8 years old, had attacked another child who tried to take food from his plate. The fight was vicious enough to require the sheriff's intervention. Witnesses described James biting and clawing, fighting with an intensity completely inappropriate for the minor provocation. After that, the Harwells stopped attending town functions entirely. Shopkeepers served them quickly and without conversation. Neighbors stopped visiting. When the family passed on the road, people crossed to the other side. They had become ghosts before they ever entered their cellar, erased from community memory, while still technically alive. A farmer named Elijah Cross provided perhaps the most telling testimony to investigators. He had been the Harwells' nearest neighbor, living 3 miles distant. "We heard them sometimes in autumn," he said. "Howling. That's the only word for it. Not screaming, not calling out. Howling like wolves calling to each other across the hills. First time I heard it, I got my rifle thinking predators were near my livestock. But it was coming from the Harwell place. After that, I didn't go near there anymore. None of us did. We just pretended that Hollow was empty, and whatever lived there wasn't our concern." The community had made an unspoken agreement. They would sell the Harwells supplies. They would take their money, but they would not acknowledge what was happening to them. It was easier to let them disappear than to confront the impossible truth that people could transform into something else entirely. 3 physicians arrived from Lexington in late April of 1835, summoned by Archaeological initial reports. What they documented over 6 weeks of intensive study would challenge every accepted principle of human biology and ultimately provide no answers, only deeper questions. Dr. Marcus Fleming specialized in diseases of the blood. His examination revealed that the Harwells' blood composition changed dramatically between their active and dormant states. During wakefulness, their blood showed elevated levels of certain compounds he had only previously observed in animals preparing for winter torpor. White cell counts dropped to dangerously low levels, yet the family showed no signs of infection or immune compromise. "The body is essentially shutting down non-essential functions," Fleming wrote in his report. "But the mechanism by which this occurs voluntarily and the ability to sustain it for months contradicts everything we understand about human physiology. These people should be dead. By every medical standard, their winter state is incompatible with life." Dr. Helena Constantine, one of the few women practicing medicine in Kentucky at that time, focused on the neurological aspects. She conducted tests on the family's reflexes, pain response, and cognitive function. Her findings were deeply troubling. The younger children, those born after the family's transformation began, showed significant developmental abnormalities. Their ability to speak was severely limited. They demonstrated problem-solving skills far below their chronological ages, but in certain areas, they exceeded normal human capability. Their sensory perception was extraordinarily acute. They could detect scents imperceptible to the medical staff. They heard conversations through closed doors. Their night vision was remarkably enhanced. "I tested young Thomas in complete darkness," Constantine recorded. "He navigated the room without difficulty, identifying objects by touch and smell alone. When I asked him to describe what he was doing, he could not articulate the process. It was instinctive, not learned. His brain has developed pathways that should not exist in human neurology." The third physician, Dr. Alan Pritchard, attempted to understand the metabolic processes at work. He calculated that based on the family's body mass and the duration of dormancy, they should require approximately 1,500 calories per day to maintain basic organ function. Over a 5-month winter, that meant they needed to store roughly 200,000 calories in fat reserves. The mathematics were impossible. No human body could safely carry enough fat to fuel such prolonged dormancy. Yet the Harwells accomplished it year after year. Pritchard theorized that their metabolic rate during sleep dropped to levels previously thought incompatible with mammalian life. perhaps as low as 5% of normal resting metabolism. They are not sleeping, Pritchard concluded. They are entering a state closer to suspended animation. Their cells are barely functioning, operating at the absolute minimum threshold required to prevent death. How they achieve this without organ damage or brain death is beyond current medical understanding. The physicians attempted controlled experiments, with Sarah's reluctant consent. They monitored her closely as autumn approached, documenting the physiological changes. Her appetite increased dramatically in late September. Her body temperature began dropping gradually in early October. By mid-October, she was sleeping 16 hours daily. The compulsion was overwhelming, undeniable. "I can feel it starting," she told them one evening in October. "Like gravity pulling me down. Every part of my body wants to stop, to rest. Fighting it feels like drowning." The doctors tried to prevent her descent into dormancy using various stimulants and interventions. Nothing worked. By November 1st, Sarah was unconscious despite their efforts. Her body had claimed its right to shut down, regardless of medical interference. What disturbed the physicians most was their inability to identify the initial cause. The contaminated grain from 1814 had been their primary theory, but analysis showed nothing unusual. They examined the family's water source, their clothing, the soil around their property. Every test came back normal. Dr. Fleming's final report to the Kentucky Medical Society concluded with unsettling honesty. "We are confronted with a transformation in human biology that appears permanent and inexplicable. These individuals have adapted to survive in a manner that should not be possible. Whether this represents disease, evolution, or something we lack the scientific framework to understand remains unknown. What is certain is that they can never return to normal human existence." Of all the disturbing aspects of the Harwell case, nothing troubled the medical team more than the 3 youngest children. Thomas, Catherine, and James had never known a winter awake. Their entire existence had been divided between frantic summers and unconscious winters, and the evidence suggested they were becoming something fundamentally different from human. Thomas, at 5 years old, possessed a vocabulary of perhaps 30 words. Most were simple nouns: food, water, sleep, mother. He could not form complete sentences. Yet his comprehension of non-verbal communication was extraordinary. He understood tone, gesture, and facial expression with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Dr. Constantine noted that he responded to her emotional state before she was consciously aware of it herself. "The boy watched me constantly," she wrote. "When I felt anxious, he moved away and became very still. When I was calm, he approached. He was reading signals I did not know I was transmitting. This is not intelligence in the conventional sense. It is something more primal, more instinctive." Catherine, age 12, could speak in broken sentences, but showed no interest in abstract concepts. She could not grasp numbers beyond simple counting. She had no understanding of past or future, living entirely in the immediate present. But she demonstrated remarkable spatial memory, able to navigate complex environments after a single exposure. She never forgot a scent or a face. When Dr. Fleming attempted to teach her basic arithmetic, she became agitated and unresponsive. But when he hid food in various locations around the examination room, she found every piece within minutes, even those concealed in containers she had never seen before. Her mind had developed for survival, not civilization. James, 9 years old, never made eye contact with the physicians. He communicated through sounds rather than words: soft grunts, low humming, occasionally a sharp bark of alarm. Physical examination revealed his jaw structure had subtly changed, the muscles overdeveloped from years of aggressive chewing. His teeth showed wear, patterns consistent with consuming raw meat, though the family insisted they always cooked their food during waking months. The most disturbing observation came during feeding times. The three younger children ate with their hands, hunched protectively over their plates, making low growling sounds if anyone approached too closely. They consumed food rapidly, barely chewing, as if expecting it to be taken away. After eating, they immediately became lethargic, often falling asleep where they sat. Dr. Constantine attempted basic developmental assessments. She showed Thomas pictures of common objects, asking him to identify them. He recognized tools, animals, and food immediately. But when shown images of churches, schools, or groups of people, he became confused and anxious. These concepts held no meaning for him. He had never attended school, never been in a community gathering, never experienced normal childhood social development. These children are not delayed, Constantine concluded in her notes. They are developing along an entirely different pathway. Thomas does not need to read, because his survival has never depended on literacy. Catherine does not need mathematics because she has other ways of understanding her environment. They are adapting to the existence they have been born into. The physicians attempted to socialize the children with others their age, bringing in several children from town under careful supervision. The experiment lasted less than an hour. The Harwell children showed no interest in play or conversation. They huddled together in a corner, watching the other children with blank expressions. When one town child approached Thomas with a toy, he grabbed it and tried to hide it, growling when asked to return it. Most troubling was their response to autumn. As September progressed, all three children began exhibiting anxious behaviors. They hoarded food obsessively. They spent hours arranging and rearranging sleeping areas in their room. Catherine repeatedly asked when they could go back to the deep place, meaning the cellar. For them, dormancy was not a curse to be cured, but a natural part of existence they actively craved. Dr. Brennan recorded a conversation with Elizabeth about her youngest children that revealed the depths of her despair. "They were born into this nightmare," she said quietly. "They think it's normal. Thomas has never played with another child. Catherine has never been to church. James has never heard music. What kind of life have I given them? They're my babies, but they're not children. Not really. They're something else, and it's my fault." When asked if she believed her children could ever live normal lives, Elizabeth's answer was immediate. No, and trying to force them to would be crueler than leaving them as they are. By August of 1835, state authorities had reached an unavoidable conclusion. The Harwell family could not return to their isolated existence, nor could they be integrated into normal society. What followed was a series of decisions that, while made with good intentions, would prove fatal. The Kentucky State Medical Board convened to determine the family's fate. Dr. Fleming argued passionately for allowing them to continue their natural cycle under medical supervision. "These people have survived 2 decades in this condition," he told the board. "Interfering with their established pattern may prove more dangerous than the condition itself." But political pressure overwhelmed medical caution. Newspapers had published sensationalized accounts of the hibernating family, and public opinion demanded action. Governor James Moorhead issued a directive. The Harwells must be treated, not accommodated. The state could not condone what amounted to an inhuman existence. The family was divided in September. John and Elizabeth were committed to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum for the Insane in Lexington. The institution had experience with unusual cases and facilities that could be adapted for their needs. Sarah, being of age and demonstrating the most cognitive function, was given a choice. She chose to stay with her parents. The three younger children presented a different problem. They could not be classified as insane, merely developmentally abnormal. After lengthy debate, they were placed in the Kentucky Medical College's new experimental facility, where physicians could study their condition while attempting various treatments. The separation was traumatic. Elizabeth had to be physically restrained as her younger children were taken away. The children themselves became violent, requiring multiple attendants to control them. Thomas bit one orderly badly enough to require stitches. Catherine screamed continuously for 3 hours. James went completely silent and refused to eat for 5 days. At the asylum, doctors implemented a strict protocol to prevent the family's autumn dormancy. As September progressed and the Harwells showed signs of their typical pre-hibernation behaviors, staff administered strong stimulants: coffee, medicinal compounds containing cocaine, cold water immersion, forced physical exercise. The treatments were agony. Sarah's testimony, recorded during a brief lucid period, described the experience. It feels like being held underwater while your lungs scream for air. Every cell in your body is trying to shut down, and they're forcing you to stay awake. Father stopped speaking after the first week. Mother just cries. I don't know how much longer we can endure this. By mid-October, John Harwell's health began deteriorating rapidly. His heart rate became irregular. He developed tremors. The forced wakefulness was destroying his body's ability to regulate basic functions. On October 23rd, he suffered what physicians classified as an apoplectic seizure and died 3 days later. The autopsy revealed massive organ failure, as if his body had simply given up trying to function. At the medical college, the children fared no better. Doctors tried a different approach, attempting gradual adaptation rather than forced prevention. They reduced the children's food intake during autumn, hoping to eliminate the gorging behavior. They kept them in well-lit rooms to combat drowsiness. They engaged them in constant activity. Catherine began having convulsions in early November. Despite emergency interventions, she slipped into a coma on November 8th and died 2 days later. The physician's notes indicated her death resulted from metabolic collapse, though they could not explain the precise mechanism. The deaths shocked the medical community. Emergency meetings were called. Dr. Fleming submitted a furious resignation from the state medical board, arguing that the treatments had amounted to torture. "We have killed these people," he wrote, "through our arrogance and refusal to accept that some conditions cannot be cured, only endured." In December, authorities finally relented. Elizabeth and Sarah were allowed to sleep, their dormancy carefully monitored in the asylum. At the medical college, Thomas and James were given the same mercy. But the damage had been done. Their bodies had been pushed past the breaking point, their natural cycles disrupted beyond recovery. Elizabeth Harwell never woke from that winter's sleep. Her heart simply stopped in February of 1836, her body unable to sustain even the minimal functions of dormancy after months of forced stress. Sarah survived until spring, but died in May, her system too weakened to handle the metabolic demands of waking. She was 20 years old. Thomas Harwell died in March of 1837, his small body failing during an attempted awakening. James survived until June, but his death was perhaps more merciful than continued existence. He had stopped responding to any stimuli, existing in a state between consciousness and dormancy that physicians had no name for. The last of the Harwell family was gone within 2 years of discovery. Dr. Brennan compiled the final medical report, in August of 1837. His conclusion was damning. We discovered a family that had adapted to survive in an impossible state. Our response was to torture them back toward normalcy. Every member died in our care, victims not of their condition, but of our intervention. This case stands as a testament to the limitations of medical science and the danger of assuming we understand phenomena simply because we can observe them. The contaminated grain theory, which had driven much of the initial investigation, was never proven. Analysis of samples from the Harwell property and from the merchant who allegedly sold them grain in 1814 revealed nothing unusual. Either the contamination had degraded beyond detection, or the cause lay elsewhere entirely. Some physicians theorized the family had been exposed to some unknown fungus or parasite that altered their metabolism. Others suggested a hereditary condition triggered by environmental stress. Dr. Constantine proposed the most unsettling theory, that extreme deprivation and isolation had somehow unlocked a latent capacity in human biology, an atavistic survival mechanism buried in our evolutionary past. Perhaps humans once possessed this ability, she wrote in a letter to the Medical Society of Philadelphia. Perhaps in our distant ancestry, we survived harsh winters through torpor, as bears do. The Harwells may have accessed something we lost when we became civilized. If so, their tragedy is that they found this ancient adaptation in a modern world that could not accommodate it. Sheriff Crane ordered the Harwell property sealed in 1838. The cabin was boarded. The cellar entrance was filled with stones and earth. A posted notice warned trespassers of prosecution, though the real reason was to prevent curiosity seekers from disturbing what had become, in local memory, a cursed place. But the story did not end there. In 1841, hunters reported finding a similar underground chamber 15 miles from the Harwell property. It showed signs of recent use: straw bedding, stored food, the same careful preparations. No occupants were ever found, and authorities chose not to investigate further. Similar reports surfaced periodically over the next decade. A family in eastern Tennessee that disappeared each winter. Strange sleeping chambers discovered in remote Arkansas hills. Each time, local authorities conducted minimal investigation and kept records sealed. The Harwell case had taught an uncomfortable lesson. Some mysteries were better left unexamined. The medical journals that published accounts of the Harwell family did so with extreme caution, often in heavily redacted form. The full case files were restricted to professional medical libraries, accessible only to licensed physicians. The general public received sanitized versions that omitted the most disturbing details. By 1850, the Harwell case had largely been forgotten outside medical circles. The few scholars who studied it reached no consensus. Some called it mass hysteria. Others believed the family had deliberately faked their condition for unknown reasons. Most simply acknowledged it as an anomaly that defied explanation. The Harwell cabin slowly collapsed over the following decades. The cellar, despite being sealed, was reportedly reopened by vandals in 1863. They claimed to have found nothing but empty darkness and a smell they could not describe, something organic and ancient that made them flee without exploring further. The entrance was sealed again, this time with concrete. Today, historical records of the Harwell family exist in scattered archives across Kentucky. Researchers occasionally rediscover the case and attempt new analysis with modern understanding of biology and psychology. None have provided satisfactory explanations. The contaminated grain remains unidentified. The mechanism of their transformation remains unknown. The question of whether others like them still exist, hidden in remote places, living by cycles that have nothing to do with civilization, remains unanswered. Some questions, it seems, are not meant to be solved. Some adaptations in human nature cannot be explained by science or understood through reason. The Harwell family hibernated for 20 years, and in the end, the only certainty is that we killed them trying to wake them up. If this story left you questioning what else might be hidden in forgotten archives, hit that like button. And subscribe, because the darkest chapters of history are the ones nobody wanted recorded.